Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Review's GRE Power Hour webinar. My name is Scott, and I'll be co-hosting today's presentation, along with our GRE expert, Elissa. Everyone's lines are muted, but if you have any questions, please use the question box located in the GoToWebinar menu bar on the right side of your screen. We'll do our best to get through everyone's questions today, but if for some reason we don't get to your question, we'll definitely follow up with you afterwards. So as we go through, just put the questions in the question box and we'll address them. Our session is pretty packed with information today, so we'll probably get through all the slides in about an hour, maybe a little under, and then we're going to have time at the end for Q&A. So if you want to hang on, we're going to stay a little bit over time. We'll answer any questions that you have, and this webinar will be recorded. A link of the recording will be emailed to all registrants, and it'll also be archived on our website, so you don't have to go crazy taking notes or anything. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to one of my favorite teachers, Elissa Morel. She's been with us for over 10 years. She actually trains all of our new GRE teachers, so she's a great resource. And I'm going to pass on over to you, Elissa.
Okay, great. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the GRE Power Hour. As Scott said, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat bar, and we'll try to get to them as we go forward. My name is Elissa Morel, and I'm a GRE Master Trainer. So I have a lot of information to share with you about the GRE. So we'll talk about what the GRE is. We'll go through a few sample problems, and then we'll talk about how the Princeton Review can help you. So the GRE is the Graduate Record Examination. It's the standardized test that is required by most graduate programs. So just like you took the SAT or the ACT when you were applying to college, for grad schools, most of them require the GRE. So one of the things that you'll want to do is find out whether or not your program does require it. So if you're pursuing a master's degree or a doctoral degree, you'll probably need to take the GRE. It's also accepted by about 1,000 business schools at this point. So if you were thinking of going to business school and in lieu of taking the GMAT, they also accept the GRE. At the same time, interestingly enough, this is kind of in the last 2 years, more than a dozen, it's about 15 law schools now accept the GRE in lieu of taking the LSAT. So that's kind of a new feature, so something else to think about. So the biggest piece of advice that we can give you as you're preparing for graduate school is to do your research. The first thing you want to do is find out from the programs that you're interested in, first of all, do they even require the GRE? Not every program does. If they do require the GRE, then you want to find out about the deadlines. So it's very important for you to have all of your applications in on time, especially for the programs that have rolling admission. So you want to find out about the deadlines, and then you want to find out about the score ranges that they require. So you want to make sure that your score is within that range to be competitive. Basically, what most programs will do, because they receive more applications than they have spots, they'll utilize your GRE score along with your GPA to make that first round of cuts, right? They don't have the time nor the personnel to read through every single application that they get in. So they utilize your GRE score and your GPA to just make that first round of cuts. And then those remaining applications, then they'll review in detail, right? So then they'll focus in on these remaining parts of your application. So they'll look at your transcript in detail. They'll look at your personal statement, right? So your personal statement will tell them why this program and why you're the right candidate for the program. They'll look at the letters of recommendation. Hopefully those letters of recommendation will be from professors in the field who can speak knowledgeably about whether or not you're the type of student who can succeed in a graduate program. They'll look at your resume, which should include not only your work experience, but any research or volunteer work that you've done. And then finally, they'll look at they'll evaluate you from your interview. So what we always say is that a great GRE score won't necessarily get you into a program, but a bad one can certainly keep you out because you won't even get beyond that first round of cuts. But just because you have a fantastic GRE score doesn't mean you're going to get into the program, because all of these other pieces of your application are just as important. So the GRE is written by ETS, Educational Testing Services. That name might ring a bell. They're the same people who wrote or writes the SAT. You remember how much fun the SAT was? Well, the GRE is just as much fun. So the test itself is administered at Prometric testing centers. It is a computer-based test. So unlike the SAT or the ACT where you took that at your local high school, the GRE is offered only at these Prometric testing centers. So if you're planning to take the GRE, you would just go into gre.org, put in your state, and it will list the testing centers that are available to you. The test itself, unlike the SAT or the ACT, which were only offered at certain points of the year, the GRE is offered year-round on almost every day of the week. Many centers offer it multiple times in a day, usually an early morning time, midday, and end of day. The most popular day of the week for students to take the test is on a Saturday. That's when a lot of people are off from work and off from school. The most popular time of year for people to take the test is in the fall because lots of programs have December 1 and January 1 deadlines. So if you're only available to take the test on a Saturday in the fall, like in October, you might need to make that reservation, 4 to 6 weeks in advance to get the location that you want, the day that you want, the time of day that you want. But if you're available to take the test on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, which is kind of considered off-peak, in like February or March, you could probably make that reservation within a week or even 2 weeks. But we always say, know your timelines and make your reservation as soon as possible so that you definitely get the location that you want, the day of the week that you want, the time of the day that you want. And also by having that reservation, that kind of puts the goal in mind for you and helps you to start working towards it. If you're just kind of not knowing when you're going to take the test, you're not likely to do much prep for it. So it's good to have that date on the calendar, and that kind of forces you to start prepping for it. So you can take the test once every 21 days. So if you take the test, for instance, on May 1st, you don't like the scores that you get, you can turn around and take it again on May 22nd. You can take it up to 5 times within a 12-month period. But your scores are good for 5 years, but not every program will accept scores that are 5 years old. So as part of your research, that's something else that you should do. You should determine how, whether your program will accept scores that are 5 years old. Not every student is going directly to grad school, and it sometimes does make sense to take the test while you're in school and used to the testing environment. Generally, those students do better. But if you're not planning to go to grad school for several years after graduation, you might end up taking them again. A lot of programs will say if your scores are more than 3 years old, they'll want you to take the test again. Once you take the test, it takes about 10 to 15 days for your official scores to arrive at the schools that you're applying to. So if you have a January 1 deadline, the latest you can take the test and still have your scores there on time would be December 15th, right? But you should obviously be doing that much sooner. So the GRE itself is about, you'll hear people say it's about 4 hours of testing time. You do have to be at the test center 30 minutes early. It is a multi-stage test. And basically what that means is that you can skip around within a section, you just can't skip sections. So like the SAT and the ACT, where you're only allowed to stay in that one section and it told you could not turn the page, this is the same thing. You can move around within a section, but you can't skip sections, so you can't go back to another section either. And the test is adaptive by section. There is no order of difficulty within a section, however. So a question 1 is not easier than a question 20. So one of our biggest pieces of advice is to take each section on a first pass, second pass approach, right? So on your first pass, as you're going through the questions, do the questions that are easiest for you. Don't get stuck on any one question. If a question presents any difficulty for you, just skip it and keep going. Then on your second pass, you would revisit those questions that you skipped. Maybe you misread something, maybe you miscalculated something, and then you could answer it then. And if you're still not able to answer it, then you could just enter your letter of the day, because there is no guessing penalty on the GRE, so you should not leave any questions blank. So this is overall what the sections look like. The first section is always the analytical writing assessment. It's comprised of 2 essays, an issue essay and an argument essay. They're each 30 minutes. And you get a separate score from 0 to 6 on the essay section. Then you'll have 2 quantitative sections. They're each 20 questions, 35 minutes each, and you'll get a score from 130 to 170. The verbal sections, also 2 of those, also 20 questions, but they're 5 minutes shorter. So they're each 30 minutes. And again, you'll get a score of 130 to 170. And then finally, there's an experimental section. It could be math or verbal. The experimental section will show up anytime after the analytical writing assessment. So the analytical writing assessment, the essays are never experimental. So, and basically what's happening there is ETS is just utilizing you as unpaid guinea pigs, right? So they're having you do the research for them. They're trying out questions and seeing how students respond. And based upon those responses, they're determining whether they would use those questions in a future test. Unfortunately, you can't skip the experimental section. You have to do it. Again, it would either be a verbal section experimental or a math. It's not designated as such, so you won't know which section is experimental, so it kind of forces you to do your best on it. So at the end of the test, if you've had 3 verbal sections, you'll realize that one of them was experimental. If you had 3 math sections, you'll realize that one of them is experimental. And again, it does not count towards your score. So the question that we always get is, well, what is a good score for the GRE? And the answer is it's the score that gets you into the program that you're applying to. So again, you want to be within the score range that they mention. You want to be in the middle to the upper end of that score range to make yourself very competitive. So it's not something that you can compare yourself to your peers. Every program is different. Some programs are more concerned about the math section than the verbal section, and vice versa. The other thing that you should know, though, is that some programs will tell you what the score is for admissions, but then there might be, if you got a higher score, you would be eligible for more scholarship money. So that's something else you want to investigate. So in terms of the average scores, you can see that the quantitative section is roughly a 153. That puts you in the 50th percentile. The verbal section is a 150. Again, that puts you in the 50th percentile. And the analytical writing assessment is a 3.48. So I had said to you before that the scale for the analytical writing assessment is 0 to 6. So 6 is considered excellent, 5 is considered strong, 4 is considered adequate. So most programs want at least a 4, and you can see that the average is slightly below that. So the majority of students, or more than half the students, are scoring below that. So again, do your research, find out from the programs that you're applying to what kind of scores they're looking for. So the test itself is adaptive by section. So it's not adaptive by question, which is how the GMAT works. It's adaptive by section. And basically what that means is that everybody gets a medium level, medium difficulty level first verbal section and first math section. If you do well on that first section, you'll get a harder second section and your score can go to the top. You could get a perfect score. If you do okay on that first section, meaning you get about half right, half wrong, you'll get a medium second section, but your score will be capped. You won't be able to score up to a 170. Your score might be capped at, like, let's say, like a 159. If you do poorly on that first section, meaning you get fewer than half the questions correct, you'll get an easy second section and your score will be capped even further, right? You won't even be able to score get an average score on the test. So your score is dependent upon not only the number of questions that you answer correctly, but also the difficulty of those questions. So a student who's in the harder second section but has fewer correct answers than a student in a medium second section will still probably have a higher score because they've answered more difficult questions. So again, it's very important for you to do well on your first math section and your first verbal section so that you can get into the harder second sections and your score range could possibly go to the top. So in terms of what the content looks like, most students are surprised to find out for the math, it's really high school, junior high math. It's arithmetic, algebra, geometry, and data interpretation. So the math, it does not test college math, and it does not go even all the way through algebra 2. So there's no trigonometry, there's no calculus, there's no proofs or theorems. So it's math that you've had in junior high. For some students, the problem with that is it's math they haven't seen in a long time. The other issue is, unlike the SAT or the ACT, where you could bring in your graphing calculator and have all these formulas programmed into it, on the GRE, you're not allowed to bring in your own personal calculator. You're using a basic on-screen calculator. It's a 4-function calculator. It looks like this. It's very primitive. It does not do exponents. Most students find it a bit cumbersome to use. What ETS will say is it's not a test of long calculations, so you really shouldn't actually need a calculator. It's really a test of your math reasoning ability. So if you find yourself with a page of calculations, you're probably doing something wrong. So as I had said to you before, in the math section of the test, there are 20 questions and you have 35 minutes. So you have less than 2 minutes per question. And ETS will say every question theoretically should be able to be solved in less than 2 minutes. The verbal section of the test is very similar to the old SAT. Half the questions are reading comprehension, and the other half, text completion and sentence equivalence. These are very much vocabulary-driven questions. So really no change there. It's really all reading comprehension, which is things that you're used to, and vocabulary. There's no grammar on this test. We find that lots of students say that, students who've done well on the verbal section of the old SAT seem to do well on the verbal section of the GRE. So this is how they get to that overall, approximately 4 hours of testing time. As I said to you before, the essays always come first. So that's your section 1. It's the 2 essays. So that's an hour of testing time. Then you'll have 2 other sections, could be math and then verbal, or verbal and then math. And then you get a 10-minute break where you can get out of your seat. In between these sections, you have a 1-minute in your seat break. And this is your first and only 10-minute break where you're allowed to get out of your seat. Then you come back, you have 3 remaining sections, and then the test will be over and a screen will appear, and you'll be able to see your math and verbal scores. So GRE does have what's known as Score Select, and basically what that means is if you've taken the test more than once, you do have some options in terms of the scores that you want to report. So on test day, you can decide not to have your scores sent at all. Let's say you for whatever reason you have an awful day and you bomb the test, you can say, all right, I'm not having my score sent anywhere. Or you can have your scores sent to 4 schools for free. If you've taken the test more than once, you can decide to have just that day's score sent, or you can have all your previous scores sent. After test day, for a fee of $27 per program, right now that's what it is, those fees increase every year, you can just have that day's score sent, you can have all your previous scores sent, or you can select a specific test date and have both the math and verbal score sent from that. So let's say you take the test in February, March, and April, and your March results are the best. You can decide just to have your March scores sent. What you can't do is you can't say, well, I'm going to send my February math scores and then just send my April verbal scores. If you're picking a test date, both your math and verbal scores have to be sent. So as part of your research, what you want to do is find out from the programs that you're applying to, what do they do with multiple scores? And what you'll find for the majority of programs is they will take your highest math and your highest verbal score regardless of the number of tests. That's what the majority of programs do. So they kind of super score it the same way colleges do with the SAT. They'll take your highest math and your highest verbal. Not every program does do that. Some programs look for a trend, or some will take your most recent scores. So again, do your research and find out what your program does with multiple scores. So as I said to you before, the GRE is a computer-based test. It's only offered at Prometric testing centers. Some students are a bit surprised when they get to a Prometric testing center by the level of security. So they're very concerned that information it does not get into the center that shouldn't, that you're not cheating in any way, and that information does not get out that shouldn't. So security is a primary concern for them. So the first thing that will happen when you get to a Prometric testing center is you'll be meet with the receptionist. She's going to check your identification. It must match exactly the way you registered. So however your name is on your identification is exactly the way you want to register. So you don't want to hyphen your name. You don't want to leave out a middle initial or use a nickname. Make sure it matches exactly the way your ID is set up. All of your personal belongings go into a locker. You're not allowed to bring anything with you into the testing room other than the key to the locker and your identification. So you're not even allowed to wear any jewelry into the testing room other than a wedding band or an engagement ring. Everything has to go into the locker, your cell phone, everything. Some centers will have a finger scan, some have a palm scan. They will wand you. They ask you to empty out your pockets to show them that you're not bringing anything into the testing room with you. If you're wearing glasses, they'll ask to inspect your glasses. They ask you to sign an agreement saying that you're taking the test for no other reason to go to grad school. They supply you at the table where you're sitting with pencils and 6 sheets of scratch paper that are stapled together where you'll be doing any of your calculations or note taking. So you can see right here, this is kind of what the testing room looks like. It's just computer terminal after computer terminal. You're being filmed the entire time that you're there. There are people taking other types of tests at Prometric Testing Center. So TOEFL exams are administered there. Series 7 exams are administered there. So people are coming and going at different times. So you do have the option of utilizing noise blocking headphones. So lots of students will say, well, the GRE really isn't testing anything that I've learned in college, right? It's not testing college math. It's, reading comprehension and vocabulary. I've got a great GPA. I'm just going to go in and take this test cold. And many of those students don't do very well. The reason for that is the GRE does not test you in the way that you're being tested in college, right? So in college, generally your professors are testing you on things that you've currently learned, and they give you sufficient time to complete the test, right? So the GRE is meant to trick you, it's meant to trap you. Time is going to be of the essence, and it's testing you on things that are not necessarily fresh in your memory. The analogy that we always use is, if you knew everything there was to know about physics and you went in to take a test in physics and the test was written in Russian and you didn't speak Russian, you would not do very well on the test. And that's the same situation with the GRE. If you're not familiar with the way they word these questions, the tricks and traps inherent in the questions, you're not going to do well on the GRE. So it's best for you to familiarize yourself with the test and the types of questions and how they can be presented. So we have a few sample questions to show you. The first question is a quantitative comparison question. So this would appear in the math section. So in the math section, you'll have these types of questions, quantitative comparison. You'll generally have 8 in one section and 7 in the other. They come right in a row, so it'll be their first 8 questions in one section, your first 7 questions in the other. And quantitative comparison is just that. It's asking you to compare the two quantities. So in this case, you're comparing quantity A, which is F, which is the height of this triangle on the left, to quantity B, which is G, which is the height of the triangle on the right. And you have 4 answer choices to select from. So the first one, if you selected this, we'll call it answer choice A, you would say that quantity A is greater. If you select this one, which is answer choice B, you're saying that quantity B is greater. If you select C, you're saying they're equal. And if you select answer choice D, you're saying that the relationship cannot be determined. And each of these answer choices has a 25% chance of being correct. There's not one answer that is correct more often than the others. So one of the tricks and traps on the quantitative comparison section is that the figures are not necessarily drawn to scale. You might have noticed when you first looked at these two triangles, they look exactly alike. But on further inspection, you'll notice that this triangle on the left is actually isosceles, right? It has 2 equal sides, but it has a shorter base, whereas the triangle on the right is equilateral. It has 3 equal sides. So they're asking you to compare the heights, and most students would go about this by utilizing the Pythagorean theorem, which would absolutely work. Generally, when students solve a question that way, it takes them about 2.5 to 3 minutes to solve it because these are not special right triangles, and you would have to enter those calculations to figure out the sides. And when I said to you before on the test, on the math section of the test, you have 20 questions in 35 minutes. You have less than 2 minutes per question. So not only do you want to answer the questions accurately, but you also want to answer them efficiently, right? You don't want to be spending an inordinate amount of time on a question and then sacrificing some questions that come after. So you want to look for ways to answer questions quickly and efficiently. So you can reason to the right answer. Like these 2 sides of the triangle, let's say if you took your 2 index fingers, which presumably are the same size, and you made a triangle with them and pretended that your base was 6.0, as you pull out from a base of 6.0 to 6.1, you'll notice that your fingers have to drop down, right, to stretch out from that base of 6.0 to 6.1. So clearly the height G has to be less than the height F. So therefore, quantity A is greater, so it's answer choice A. So I just reasoned to that right answer in less than 15 seconds, and that's something that you can do as well. You don't need to have a page of calculations. Unlike in your math class in high school, remember you would probably lose points. Your teacher would say, oh, you didn't show your work and take off points. Here it's just a matter of you clicking on the correct response. Although you have that scratch paper to do your calculations, they're not grading that. You certainly have to hand it in before you leave, but they're not grading that. So whenever you do have a page of calculations, as I said to you before, you're probably doing something wrong. So you should look for ways to reason to the correct answer rather than doing all of these detailed calculations. So quantitative comparison questions, as I said to you, about 15 of those questions. You're also going to have other types of multiple choice questions. So in this question, it says in the equation above, if n is an integer, which of the following could be a possible value of x? So lots of students will say, oh, on my first pass, I'm not going to do this type of question. It's too scary. So they'll save it and come back to it on their second pass. And the reason they'll say that is because a lot of students are afraid of radicals, they're afraid of fractions. So when you revisit on the second pass, our piece of advice is, don't panic on a harder math question. Generally, there are other ways to approach it, either by factoring or by rewriting it, right? So if n is an integer, and an integer is a whole number, then in order for n to be a whole number, this needs to be a perfect square, right? So one thing you might have noticed when you were looking at this is I have 2 7s all the way on the left side, and I have 5 7s all the way over on the right side. That's done purposely. If I combine 2 7s plus 5 7s, that gives me a total of 7 7s or 1. Same thing if I have 1/3 here, I have 2/3 here, I can combine those two, and that's a total of 3/3, which equals 1. And I could take 4/9 and add it to 5/9, which gives me a total of 9/9 or 1. So now I can rewrite this as n equals the square root of 3 plus x, right? That's much more manageable now for me to evaluate the question. So now what I'll do is I'll take each of these answer choices and plug it in for x to see which one gives me a perfect square, right? So if I look at answer choice A, 0, 3 plus x, the square root of 3, is not a perfect square, so I'll eliminate answer choice A. Answer choice B, 2/63, the same thing. If I add that to 3, that's not going to give me a perfect square, so eliminate answer choice B. Answer choice C is 1, so 3 plus 1, square root of 4, which equals 2, so n would equal 2, so I'm definitely going to pick answer choice C. Now, one thing you might have noticed here is I don't have ovals for answer choices, I have squares. And the question says, indicate all such values. This is an all that apply question. And what that means is there could be more than one right answer, right? There could be 3 right answers, 4 right answers. You have to pick as many right answers as it possibly could appear. And there's no partial credit. So if you don't pick all the right answers, you don't get partial credit for the ones that you pick that are correct. So even though I know definitely that answer choice C1 is correct, I still have to look at the remaining answer choices. So answer choice D, 65/63, again, if I add that to 3, that's not going to give me a perfect square, so I'll eliminate answer choice D. Answer choice E4, 3 plus 4, square root of 7, not a perfect square, so I'll eliminate that. And then finally, answer choice F6, 3 plus 6, that's the square root of 9, right, which is 3, so n would equal 3, so I'm definitely picking that one. So if I don't select C and F, no credit for the question, right? I have to pick both of those answers to get credit for this question. So it is a standardized test, which means it's a predictable test. Standardized tests are based upon you being predictable test takers, right? In ETS's eyes, regardless of your major, regardless of the school that you're going to, you're very predictable, right? If I say the word peanut butter, probably the first thought that came to your mind was jelly, right? Because you're used to peanut butter and jelly. If I say cat, you're probably thinking dog, right? It's raining cats and dogs. If I asked you to think of a number, and I didn't put any parameters around it, I just said think of a number, I'm sure most of you did not pick 0 or a negative number or a decimal or a fraction or a number greater than 1,000 or a number greater than 500 or greater than 100 or greater than even 50. In fact, when I ask students that, think of a number, the majority of students will pick a positive integer less than 25. It's kind of just what we all do. And ETS knows that. They know that when they write a question and they mention variable x, subconsciously most students are assuming that x is a positive integer. They're not thinking that x could be 0 or a negative number or a fraction or a decimal, right? And that influences the way students solve the question. It influences the answer choices that they pick, right? ETS knows that, so they create certain answer choices to be very tempting to students, right? To distract you. They know that when it's a geometry question and they ask you to solve for the perimeter of the figure, many students will mistakenly solve for the area. And so even though you've solved the question incorrectly, you'll still find an answer that matches the incorrect way that you've solved, because ETS knows the way students think. So we work with students to not be predictable test takers. One of the ways that we do that is through a strategy that's called trigger response. In math questions, there are certain content triggers, and we give our students very scripted responses so that they don't fall for these tricks and these traps. One math trigger is with averages, right? So averages are generally a very easy concept for most students. If I said to you that you took 3 tests, you scored 100, a 100, and a 70, what is your average? Most students would know how to solve that. They would say, oh, I just add them up and divide by 3. So I'd add up the 3 tests, 100 plus 100 plus 70 gives me 270, divide by 3, my average is 90. Easy. But that's not how average questions are presented on the GRE. Right? They're presented like this. So it says the average, and whenever they use the words average on the GRE, they'll always then add the phrase arithmetic mean, so that to distinguish it from a harmonic mean or a geometric mean, of a set of 7 numbers is 21. If a certain number n is removed from the set, the average of the remaining numbers in the set is 23. They're asking you to compare n to 10. So it's a quantitative comparison question. So students who could quickly answer my question previously about the 3 tests, now when they're faced with a question like this, don't even know where to start, and they start to panic. What happens? Think about what happens when you're taking a test and you're not able to answer one question. And then you get to the next question and you don't know where to start it. And then you get to the next question, you don't know where to start it, right? Then you start really panicking and your confidence level decreases rapidly. And some students will have a full-blown panic attack. And that might affect not only your work for that one section, but for some students, that starts affecting every section in the entire test, right? So we don't want that to happen with our students. We want to make sure that you have a place to start and build your confidence. Right? So with averages, one of the tools we give our students, it's called an average pie. It's just a way for you to organize your information. You have the total, a divisor line, the number of things, and the average. So in my example before, with the 3 tests, the total was 270. The number of things was 3 because there were 3 tests. 270 divided by 3 resulted in the average of 90. If you have the number of things in the average, you know that you should multiply them together to get the total, right? So again, it organizes your information and lets you identify the missing piece of information. In this question, because it mentions average twice, I should have 2 average pies on my scratch paper. So now we'll deal with the question in bite-sized pieces. It said there's a set of 7 numbers, right? So I know my number of things should be 7. It said that average was 21, so I'm going to pop 21 in over here. As soon as I have these 2 pieces of information, I realize I have to multiply them together. So 7 times 21 gives me 147. I drew a second average pie. Now it says a certain number n is removed from the set. So instead of having 7 numbers, I have 6. It says that average is 23, so I'm going to pop that in over there. Again, since I have these 2 pieces of information, I multiply them together. 6 times 23 gives me 138. So now the difference between 147 and 138 is going to be n. And so that difference is 9. So clearly, since 9 is less than 10, quantity B is greater, right? So the average pie and other tools that we give students like that are just a way to help students to work through a question much more quickly. You don't have to overtax your brain. You don't have to think about an algebraic equation, right? It gives you a starting point, right? You can almost work on autopilot. Oh, I see averages. This is what I should do. And the next thing you know, you're going through the question efficiently and solving it and building your confidence rather than sitting there and panicking and saying, I don't even know where to start. So that's the math section of the test. Most students will find that with a little bit of practice, about 2 months of practice, their math scores will go up quite quickly. Because again, this is math that you've seen before. The verbal section of the test, sometimes students find that those scores don't increase quite as quickly. The reason for that is half the questions are vocabulary driven. The other half are reading comp, right? And not everybody likes reading comprehension. Most people will say, oh, they like reading things if they're interested in it. But on the GRE, these passages are not necessarily stimulating passages. Generally, they're about 3 major areas. They're usually about natural science, social science, or arts and humanities. Again, you'll have 10 questions, and that's roughly about 6 passages. The thing that's different is that the passage shows up on one side of your screen and the question shows up on the other, and you can only see one question at a time. So when you were taking the SAT or the ACT, you were able to see all the questions at once. You had the ability to highlight things, to underline things. You could see the entire passage at once. Sometimes on the GRE, you have to scroll down. So it's a different way of dealing with things. You obviously cannot highlight things here. You have to take notes. One of the things that we find for reading comprehension is that most students go about it in the wrong way. They will read the entire passage first and then go to answer the question. And because these passages are so dense and for most students so boring, as students are reading them, their minds will start to wander. And think about when you're reading something, your mind starts to wander. Generally, you go back and reread, right? And sometimes students' minds will wander a second time or a third time. And a passage of this length, 40 lines, might take a student 2 or 3 minutes to read. And then they go to the question. Well, on the verbal section of the test, again, as I said, you do have 20 questions, but now you only have 30 minutes to answer those 20 questions. On the math side, you had 35. On the verbal, you only have 30 minutes. So you have only a minute and a half per question. So if you spend 2 to 3 minutes just reading the passage, right, you've sucked up the time for 2 questions, right? So you don't want to spend so much time reading in detail. You want to look at the question. In this case, you have the primary purpose of the passage. So this is a very general question, right? So what we teach our students to do is to work through the passage, focusing in on the first sentence of each paragraph, the last sentence of the last paragraph, and really looking for 3 main things. You're working the passage looking for the main idea, the structure, and the author's position, right? And you're going to focus in on some of these words like but, right? When I see one of these, call these signposts, this is telling me that something has changed. I've gone along one way and the but is telling me that the author has changed positions here. So if you had skimmed through this passage, you realize kind of the main point of it is right here, where the author mentions that rapid developments in the marketplace have begun to change the accepted rules of business and have underscored the need for fast reaction times. And that goes about with small companies. So there's some sort of change and they're going to change the way they go about it. So I'm looking for an answer choice that says that. One strategy also to use for reading comprehension is process of elimination. So many students focus in on finding the right answer, but what you should actually do is focus in on eliminating wrong answers, right? Look for the wrong answers, eliminate those, and then compare what you're left with. One of the things that you can eliminate answer choices for is extreme language. Like answer choice E uses the word resolve. That's an extreme word. These passages don't resolve anything, right? So the same thing as answer choice A. They're not proving anything. That's very extreme, and it doesn't mention anything about change, so I'll eliminate those. I also want to make sure that my answer choice is supported by the passage. And I want to be careful with any recycled language. So answer choice D says, argue that a traditional ideology. Well, they mention an ideology here, and some students might be tempted to say, oh, that sounds familiar, but it's not supported by the passage. You want to eliminate D. So now I'm left with answer choices B and C. B says, discuss reasons why an accepted business pattern is changing, versus C, describe a theoretical model and a method whereby that model can be tested. As we skim through the passage, there was nothing about a model, and also answer choice C doesn't mention anything about a change. So eliminate answer choice C, and my correct answer is answer choice B. So in order to succeed on reading comprehension, you want to remember it's basically an open book test. It has to be in the passage, right? The questions, in order to answer the question, it has to be something in the passage, but you want to think about answer choices that are too extreme, answer choices that are a reversal of something in the passage, answer choices that use recycled language, and eliminate those answer choices first, right? So it's never going to be verbatim from the passage and match over exactly. The answer choices will always be a paraphrase. So if you work on that, reading comprehension is 50% of your grade on the verbal section of the test. So you do want to master that, but it is something that is you are capable of mastering with a great deal of practice. So that's reading comp. And then, as I said to you before, your other question types involve vocabulary. One of them is text completion. So in text completion, you'll have 6 of these in each section. You'll have 2 that are 1 blank, 2 that are 2 blank, and 2 that are 3 blank. So this is an example of a 3 blank text completion. You can see it's basically a little mini reading passage. You have a couple of sentences, and then for each blank, you have 3 possible answer choices. There is no partial credit, right? So you have to select the correct answer for all 3 blanks in order to get credit for this question. The way to go through this is to read the sentences and come up with your own words for the blank and then match them back against the answers. So in this case, it says proponents of the international style and architecture called for reducing buildings to purely functional form and found beauty in highlighting blank features. They rejected references to blank styles, offering designs indifferent to location, a quality subsequently blanked by those who viewed the style as bland or unappealing. So it doesn't matter which blank you start with first. The last blank seems to be the easiest spot. It's if they viewed the style as bland or unappealing, I know I need a negative word for this blank. So my options are disparaged, embraced, reclaimed. Disparaged is the negative word, so I'm going to select that. Now I'll go to the first blank because I think that's the next easiest place. It said they found for reducing buildings to purely functional form. So they must have found beauty in highlighting functional features. So I have structural, aesthetic, and hackneyed. I want the one that best matches with functional. That word would be structural. And then finally, for the middle blank, they rejected references to blank styles offering designs indifferent to location. So they must have rejected references to styles that were concerned with location. I have oracular, provincial, and secular. I want the one that best matches location. That would be provincial. So if I did not select structural, provincial, and disparaged, no credit for the question. I have to answer all 3 correct. And then finally, your last verbal type question is called sentence equivalence. This is where you have one sentence with one blank. Notice your answer choices are back to the squares. For sentence equivalence, you're picking the 2 answers that give the sentence the same meaning. It's always 2, and again, there's no partial credit. The strategy is basically the same as it was for the text completion. Read through the sentence, focus in on the clues, and come up with your own word for the blank, and then match that back to the answer choices. You don't want to be reading the sentence 6 times and plugging in each of these answer choices 6 times. That would take too long. So for this one, it says, although typically quite lucid in his explanations of his theories, James used words that were so blank that the students asked him to review yesterday's discussion in its entirety. So he was typically quite lucid or quite clear in his explanations. So since they asked him to review yesterday's discussion in its entirety, he must have used words that were unclear. So I'm looking for a word that means unclear. So realistic does not mean unclear, so eliminate answer choice A. Obvious is the opposite of unclear, so eliminate answer choice B. Abstruse, if you don't know the definition of it, you shouldn't eliminate it, so we'll just leave it for now if you're not sure what abstruse means. Benevolent does not mean unclear, so eliminate benevolent. Obscure, that means unclear, so I'm definitely selecting that one. And then I'm left with disparate and abstruse. So I have to determine which one do I think means unclear, right? And of course, again, there's no partial credit. So the answer is abstruse. Abstruse means unclear, difficult to comprehend. So if I don't pick abstruse and obscure, no credit for the question. I have to get both of those correct. And finally, the analytical writing assessment. As I said to you before, that's comprised of 2 essays. The issue essay always comes first. You're presented with a very general prompt. ETS says that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged based upon their major. It's a prompt that anyone could respond to. So it says, as people rely more and more on technology to solve problems, the ability of humans to think for themselves will surely deteriorate. They don't care what position you take, either you agree or disagree. Your essay is graded upon the persuasive and compelling examples that you present to support your position. So that essay is 30 minutes, and then you will have the argument essay. The argument essay is the complement of the issue essay. Now you're evaluating someone else's argument, and you're discussing the reasons that the argument is not sound, right? And discussing ways in which the author could have improved his argument. So you're going to focus in on some of the faulty assumptions. For both essays, it's really, you have to have a separate introduction, 2 or 3 body paragraphs, and a separate conclusion. You're utilizing a very basic word processing. It's just cut, paste. There's no spell check or grammar check. We tell students to take a few moments to brainstorm or think about what you're going to write first. Don't immediately start typing. Then formulate an outline and then start typing, and then save a minute or 2 to edit. Because you're being graded on not only the quality of your thinking, but the quality of your organizing. Your essay must flow well, right? It must build your points. It must be logical. And then they're also evaluating you on your adherence to the conventions of the English language, right? So if your essay is plagued with grammar and spelling errors, you're going to lose a point for that. So your essay is graded by one live human and an e-grader. They each grade your essay holistically. So each of them will give you a grade for your issue essay and a grade for your argument essay. And then those 4 grades are averaged in 0.5 increments, and that results in your essay grade. You can go to the ets.org website and see all 100 prompts for the issue essay and all 100 prompts for the argument essay, which would help you to prepare. And then finally, some of you might also have to take a subject test, which is separate from the general test. So if your major is in one of these areas, biology, chemistry, literature, math, physics, or psychology, you might also have to take a subject test. These again are separate. They're only offered 3 times in a year. So they're only offered on the 3rd Saturday in April, the 3rd Saturday in September, the 3rd Saturday in October. They are paper and pencil tests. They're less than 3 hours, but they actually test information that you learned in college, right? So these are testing your knowledge of the things that you have learned in college. The score is very bizarre. I know everyone says it's 200 to 990, but you do want to do your research. Find out if your programs require them. Not every program does require them, but if they do, you do have to plan this out since they're only offered 3 times a year. You want to find out not only if they require them, but if they don't require them, will they take them into consideration? So we have known a lot of psychology majors who said their programs didn't require them, but if they did take them, they would consider them. And we've had more than one student who really scored well on the subject test, but only did okay on the general test, and then later found out the reason they were accepted into the program is because they had done so well on the subject test, which is obviously testing subject matter that's important to that major. So again, do your research, find out if your program requires it or not, and then plan for it so you'll have the opportunity to get this in with your application deadline.
All right, so I'll jump in here and give Elissa a couple-minute break. Just a reminder, we're going to answer questions at the end. So if you've put a question into the box, we're going to circle back to that. If you have a question now, please type it in and we'll address it at the end. We're going to hang out a couple minutes overtime to answer your questions. So if you think of anything, jot down the question box and we'll get to it. But really, it's our job to help you navigate this process and help you get into your dream school, right? So if you haven't already been to our website, definitely check it out, princetonreview.com. If you go to the next slide, Elissa. There you go, perfect. So if you do nothing else as far as prepping for the GRE, take advantage. We have a free full-length practice test on our website, and you get a score report breakdown. So with that, you could kind of chart what you need to do moving forward. So start with a practice test, get a realistic assessment of your performance, and you could also search in our search engine for different grad programs, see what kind of scores are needed for your program, and you want to compare that target score to how well you do on the practice test. And from there, you can judge what you need to do to prepare for the test. And obviously we offer lots of different prep options for the GRE, but it really depends on your unique situation. And then we also have homework help, which is a great resource for students. We also call it our GPA booster. So if you're currently in school and you need help improving your grades to get a higher GPA, this is a great resource. It's online academic tutoring available 24/7. It's on demand. You can go to our website anytime, day or night, and you can get expert help in over 40 subjects. So if you need to brush up on your algebra, geometry, even essay writing, reading comp, You could log in, again, anytime, day or night, and be linked up with a live tutor in less than 2 minutes. If you go to our website, you could also do a free trial of this. So you have nothing to lose. Try it out and see what you think. And then we have, once you kind of get that target score in mind, you do the practice test. From there, come up with a prep plan, and it really depends again on your unique situation. And we do have options for every schedule and budget. So if you're the kind of student that wants kind of that comprehensive experience, we have classroom courses called our GRE Ultimate class. It's 8 classes led by someone like Elissa, going through everything, the math, the verbal, the essay. You have access to 8 full-length tests. So again, building up that test-taking stamina. Tons of online drills that you could do. We offer these in person all throughout the country, and then also in our live online classroom. So again, whatever mode works best for you. If you're the kind of student that works well on your own and you're dedicated and driven, GRE Self-Paced could be a great option for you. It basically gives you all of our online content just without a live teacher. So you can work through the drills at your own pace, all the videos, lessons, practice tests. So again, this is something that you can do on demand as needed. And then if you're the kind of student that wants one-on-one attention, we have private tutoring available too. So basically you select when and where you want to meet, and we send someone like Elissa to you. So you can meet in a local area or in a live online classroom. So lots of different options depending on your needs. So I just want to make sure that you know what's available to you. And the next slide. So the great thing about GRE Self-Paced, it's now only $199, so it's a very cost-effective way. If you are prepping on your own, you can get all the online tools for just $199. So definitely check it out. Check out the website and get going. So before we get to all the questions, we just want to do a quick poll just to kind of get a sense if you have any questions, if you want to follow up from us. So I'm going to put that on the screen now. So just take a quick moment there. So again, if you want advice on how to best prep for the GRE, if you're thinking about maybe the GMAT or maybe the MCAT for med school or the LSAT for law school, or just if you if you want more information about boosting your GPA, so maybe homework help or just general academic help. So I'll leave that open for a moment there. And again, just start typing in your questions. We'll answer some of those for you next. All right, perfect. So we're going to close that out, and then if you want, Elissa, you can go to the last slide there.
Oops.
Okay, so we're going to go through some questions now. Taking a moment to kind of cycle through them, but anything that we don't get to, or if you think of anything after the fact, you can always email us at questions@review.com. I'm always happy to get back to you after the fact. So if you think of something after we're done tonight, feel free to send me an email. So let's see. So if you're ready, Elissa, I'll hit you with a few questions here from the group.
Sure.
All right, so let's see. So David was wondering how you would recommend preparing for the verbal section as far as what materials might be good. You suggested maybe a dictionary, so I think verbal helps.
Yeah, I mean, since half the questions are vocabulary driven, in our classes, we provide our students with a deck of flashcards. You can get those flashcards online or at a Barnes & Noble. We also have an app that you can use to help with your vocabulary. So I think the big determinant is, take a free practice test and you can see the types of words that show up. They're not these arcane words that people talk about. Really, a lot of times what they're testing are the secondary and tertiary definitions of words that you're probably familiar with. So you can quickly build a vocabulary by studying word roots. That's helpful. And then I think the other thing to build the verbal score is really to understand what makes a right answer or what makes a wrong answer on the reading comp. And that's just through practice. So most students waste, as I said before, waste a lot of time reading the passage in detail. You have to learn how to go through the passage quickly and get the main point, the structure, the author's tone. But then you really have to understand how to do process of elimination. And that's just practice. And that's something we work on in detail with our students. So as Scott was saying, there's many ways to prep. And one of the simplest things you could do is just buy one of our books at the bookstore and start utilizing strategies there. We have a book called Cracking the GRE. That's a great book. And I forget, Scott, what is that, like $35? That's a good book to utilize to help you with all sections of the test.
Perfect. I know you touched on it a little bit, but do you think like Greek and Latin roots would be helpful for studying both?
Yeah, I mean, any of those, the example I always use is, you see the word maladroit, right? So you may not know what maladroit means, but you know that the prefix mal is something bad. So adroit means dexterous, so maladroit is clumsy, right? So at the very least, by knowing the word roots, you knew it was something bad. That can kind of help you get to the right word. So, word roots won't get you there 100% of the time, but they certainly help. So that is something that you could utilize. That is pretty helpful.
Perfect. So someone wanted to know if there's going to be a GMAT session like this. We actually have a GMAT versus GRE session happening at the end of this month, April. So definitely check out our website. We're going to kind of compare and contrast both tests, so kind of get a sense of both of those. So that's a good question there. Let's see. Elroy was curious about how many weeks of practice does it normally take for someone to prepare for the GRE?
So it really depends upon the person. So that's why we always say it's a good idea to take the free practice test. That'll give you your baseline score, and you can see, how much work you have to put into it. So let's say, like for instance, if anybody's doing clinical psych, right? Most of those competitive programs are looking for about, 160 in each area. So let's say you take the practice test and you score 155. Well, then you don't have a whole lot of prep to put into it. But if you take the practice test and you're scoring in the 130s, then you do have more work to put into it. But for the average student, it generally takes about 2 months. Our courses run for 8 weeks, which kind of lines up with that. But for most students, the average students, it's about 2 months of regular practice to get to the score that they want. But again, depending upon your math abilities and your vocabulary, it may take you more or less time than that.
Perfect. And then I've got two quick questions regarding the essays. Let's see, one person wanted to know how long it takes to get your essay scores, since they're graded by a computer and an actual person.
So that's part of, so what ETS will say, that's where they say, it takes 10 to 15 days for your scores to get to the schools that you're applying to. And that's really for them to score the essays. I've taken the test before and I've had my scores back sooner than that sometimes, and sometimes it takes the full 15 days. So you may get your scores within a week, and that's because they got the essays scored, or you may get it may take longer, so up to 15 days. So it really just depends upon, the time of year, how many people are taking the test, how many essays have to be scored, that sort of thing. But that's why they give those that time frame of 10 to 15 days.
Perfect. And then someone was wondering, how to best prepare for the writing section. And I know you mentioned that all the prompts are technically listed on the ETS website, so you could go crazy there if you wanted to.
Yeah, you absolutely can. You could go, you could read through the prompts and kind of get an idea of what are the issues they're presenting you with. Basically you're just kind of thinking about not so much what your position is, but what kind of examples would I have to support my position? So they're really looking for you to have these persuasive and compelling examples, very concrete examples, right? With names, dates, facts. You don't want to be using hypothetical examples or personal examples. You really want examples that make you look like an expert. So you can read through the prompts and you can get an idea of what's important, but you just want to think about things that you know about, right, through your studies, things that you might know about from history or literature or current events, what you've written a paper about, where you can come across as an expert and use that to support your position. The argument essay takes a little bit more work because you're essentially breaking down someone else's argument. So you want to think about the reasoning patterns that they're utilizing and then discuss why the argument is not sound. So you want to break down some of the faulty assumptions that they've made. So with both essays, your body paragraphs become kind of your point. So for the issue essay, each of your body paragraphs could be your examples that you're using. For the argument essay, each of your body paragraphs become the faulty assumptions that you've identified. But again, don't forget they average all 4 scores. So if you're better at writing the argument essay than the issue essay, that will help you out, right? So a good score in the argument essay offsets the issue essay. And again, most programs are just looking for a 4. Unless you're going to grad school for writing, then obviously you need a higher score. But certainly this is not the most important part of the test for the majority of students.
And I guess kind of building off that, one person wanted to know if it's smart to stay away from using the first person, but that varies depending on the type of essay, right?
Yeah, so the issue essay, you can speak in the first person. So the issue essay, you can say, I agree, I believe, I think, But on the argument essay, no, they don't want your opinion on the argument essay. What they want you to do is critique this other person's argument. So on the argument essay, you should be talking about what that author has done, what his faulty assumptions are, rather than I agree or disagree. So the issue essay begins with I. That's where you can use I. Argument essay, no, third person.
Perfect. And then let's see here. So one person talked about if they were to take the GRE multiple times, and they want to know what schools generally do if they get multiple scores, whether they take the best score or.
Yeah, so we had mentioned that before. Most schools, majority of schools, will take your best math score and your best verbal score, regardless of the number of times that you've taken it. However, one thing you should keep in mind when you start sending, beyond like 3 scores, then they start questioning your commitment to grad school. So schools don't like to see that you've taken the test 5 times. That kind of indicates to them that you're not taking it very seriously. So lots of students take it twice. There's a higher number that take it 3 times, but at that point you don't want to be sending all those scores, because then they're going to start questioning that. But the majority of schools will take your highest math and your highest verbal score. I have seen some programs that look at the most recent scores or will look at a trend, but that's a very small percentage of schools. But again, that's something that you want to do as you're researching your programs. That's a question that you would want to ask. How do they handle multiple scores?
Perfect. And I've got one more if you're up for it. Let's see.
Sure.
So David said that he noticed that when you did the math questions, they looked hard, but you kind of made them simpler, right, by showing how we could target them. He just wanted to know how you would recommend learning to look at problems in an easy way versus a hard way.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that's kind of the crux of the whole thing for our students. Not getting caught up on all the, their word problems. Some students get turned off by all the wording and so forth, but kind of, evaluating the question and breaking it down and actually asking yourself, okay, so what do I know? What do I need? How am I going to get there? And after a while, you realize, it's testing. As I said to you, there's certain concepts that it's testing over and over again. And so that's why as you're taking a practice test or you're doing a drill, you want to evaluate the work that you've done. So you want to look at the questions that you got wrong and ask why you got them wrong. And sometimes it's a miscalculation, but other times it's because you didn't even know where to start. And so if it's a question that you didn't know where to start, you want to keep track of that question so that you remember, hey, when I see this type of question, this is what I want to do. But as you're also evaluating your work, even if you get the question right, you want to find out how much time you spent on that question. And that's something that our score reports do, because you want to learn ways, even though you solved it correctly, you want to say, well, was there a better way? And that's why all of our materials, our books, our online drills, and our classes, we provide our students with detailed explanations and show them, different ways of solving questions, or the most efficient way to solve the question.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So that will wrap things up. So if you think of any other questions, please feel free to reach out. Again, you can email us at questions@review.com, and definitely check out our upcoming webinars. So again, it's princetonreview.com/webinars. Every month we have a slew of webinars coming up. So keep an eye on that. Feel free to join us in the future. Also, once again, thank you, Elissa, for sharing your expertise with us.
You're very welcome.
And thank you everyone for attending. So have a great night, everyone.